we've got stuff to talk about, so let's dive in. So we have time. I want to have a lot of time for book discussion today. So before we dive into Frankenstein directly, I want to talk just briefly about your next essay paper. So let me bring tissues in here. I'm getting over the worst cold.
I was saying.
Luke is too. We both got hit pretty hard. Okay, let's see how we can do this. All right. So you're going to be getting ready to write your papers, which I hope is kind of an exciting idea because you're having strong reactions to this book, it sounds like, which, yes, that's what we want. So with our last papers, I let you guys just kind of pick and choose what you wanted to write about with a few thoughts and ideas. For this paper, because it is such a short and specific book addressing some very specific things, we're going to go ahead and have you choose from basically a list of questions that you want to try to answer in your thesis. Does that make sense? Your thesis should always be answering some overarching question. And your thesis should be the first thing you have in place before you write your paper. We want a thesis that outlines a paper, not a paper that you then retroactively assign a thesis to. Does that make sense? Thesis, one sentence, this is what I'm writing about, okay? So I did post these to our literary analysis band page so you can continue thinking about it. But let's just take a couple minutes to go over these so you can kind of be thinking. We're gonna have our last week on Frankenstein is next week. It's a fast read. And then you're gonna be diving in. So you can kind of be thinking about this as you finish out the last volume of the book, okay? So there's about a dozen or so things. Number one, you could discuss the role of sickness in the novel. Victor often seems to fall ill after traumatic events. Is this a means of escape? And if so, is it effective? Is there another explanation for his recurring illness? The joke is that like Victor spends like a third of the book being like passed out in bed with some sort of 6-month fever, right? And that tends to happen over and over again. Number two, does the monster's eloquence and persuasiveness make it easier for the reader to sympathize with him? Why do you think the monster is articulate, and how does this compare with other characters in the book? Okay. Another angle is, in pop culture, the monster is not that way at all. He's very much a, friend kind of a thing. Very different from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Interesting to ask, why is that? Why is it different from pop culture? Number three, trace the similarities between Victor and the monster. Consider their respective relationships with nature, desires for family, and any other important parallels you find. Do Victor and the monster become more similar as the novel goes on, or do they become more different? And how does their relationship with each other develop? Okay, a lot of these you can talk about with that relationship. Fourth, Victor attributes his tragic fate to his relentless search for knowledge. Do you think that this is the true cause of his suffering? In what ways does the novel present knowledge as dangerous and destructive? So by the way, your thesis doesn't need to answer every question in each of these blocks. You just need one specific question. This is just to get your mind thinking about ideas. Like if there's something like, ooh, that's interesting, I have an answer to that and I'm excited to write about it, that's your thesis. Fifth is to examine the role of suspense and foreshadowing throughout the novel. Do you think these devices are effective, or does Victor's blatant foreshadowing reveal too much? Is he too much of a spoiler? How does foreshadowing differ from among the three main characters being Robert Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and the monster? Sixth, Plutarch's Lives, which we're going to talk about today, compares and contrasts leaders in similar roles with similar backgrounds to help us better understand the characters from Greek and the Roman era. We will talk about all that today. With this in mind, compare and contrast two characters in the novel whom you think we are meant to compare. It could be Robert Walton and Victor. It could be, the monster and Victor, or it could be even the women in the novel, or Victor's best friend. Any of those characters. There's a lot of comparisons that she's making. 7, how does Shelley use nature as a symbol of both beauty and destruction? What ways is nature good and what ways is it evil? What does the overarching theme of nature tell us about this story? 8, how does the theme of responsibility and duty relate to the parent-child relationships in Frankenstein? What is the duty and responsibility of a parent figure? We're going to talk about that a little bit today because the monster sure has some things to say. And how did parent-child relationships go right or wrong in the novel? Okay? Let's try to keep that a little quiet. I thought you were ripping out a page. I was like, oh.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you're good. Okay.
No.
9, how do themes of loneliness and isolation apply to Frankenstein, and how do we see them applied to both the characters in nature and in meaning? Okay, just a few more. Prejudice, especially that of physical beauty, is a large theme in Frankenstein. How does prejudice affect the characters of the story? How do they judge things of beauty? How do they judge things of ugliness? And is there merit in their judgments? Why or why not? And then the last few, what can we learn from the book about unchecked ambition? When is ambition a good thing that serves towards goodness and progress? And when does ambition become a destructive pursuit? How does revenge affect the characters of the story? What causes a character to seek revenge? Is it ever justified? Does it ever serve the character in a beneficial way? Why or why not? And finally, Victor blames his actions on fate and destiny. Who or what is to blame for what happened? Is Victor the one to blame for the monster's wretchedness? Or does the monster need to take responsibility? How do the themes of destiny versus free will apply to the novel? And we're going to talk about those things specifically today too. Okay? So that's just to get the juices flowing. If there's anything in there that kind of seemed interesting to you, you can keep that in mind as you finish out the novel. If you have something else that you're really zazzed to write about, totally fine. Will you just touch base with me and kind of get it pre-approved? We just want to make sure that for you guys on this paper, I want you to really hone in on, I have a very clear focused thesis, and my paper is going to follow that thesis format, okay? We're working on formatting on this paper. Any questions on that? Okay, let's talk about the book because it's so good. There's so much to say. Let's go with my thing here. Okay, so Frankenstein Volume 2. We take a sharp turn here in it. So I want to take a minute to just talk about the structure of Frankenstein now that we're a little further in, and I won't reveal too much to you. So the structure of this book is a unique structure called a framed narrative. Okay, that's where you have a story within a story, sometimes within a story within a story. Okay. There's a frame, and then you zoom in a little bit more, and then you zoom a little bit more, and then you can come back out, which is what happens here. So it's kind of like Russian nesting dolls. You can think of it that way. So we have our three narrators. We start with Robert Walton, first person. Then we get Victor Frankenstein, his story, first person. Then we come to the monster in this volume 2, and we get his story, first person. And then we zoom back out to Frankenstein. We'll now speak first person, and then we'll end with Robert Walton. So it kind of zooms in and zooms out, which is a really interesting way to do a story for a few reasons. It offers us multiple points of view and through multiple first-person accounts, which matters. We're going to talk about that in a second. It gives us more background information, like what the heck has the monster been doing this whole time? That was helpful information to have, right? It allows the author to highlight themes in different ways. We see things in both Victor and the monster that come out differently, depending on who's talking and how they're addressing it. I'm so sorry, I just feel like I'm done. Okay. It provides a shift in pace and adds energy, because anytime a new character shows up and he's like, here's my story, you're like, okay, where are we going to go with this, right? First Victor does it in the monster. And interestingly enough, Ozymandias, which is the Percy Shelley poem that we talked about the pharaoh in Egypt, also is another example of frame narrative. It's a guy who meets a man who's traveled to Egypt, and then we get all the way to Ozymandias tells his first person story through his inscription. I am Ozymandias. You know, see me, fear me, that kind of thing. Back out to that guy and back out to our original person. So it's kind of a similar structure, which you can't help but feel. You know, she would have known Percy Shelley's works well, and they would have discussed things like frame narratives. So that may have been an inspiration for it. Okay, one of the things that framed narrative gives us is something that we call the unreliable narrator. Okay, when you have one person telling the story, in general, we kind of trust that person and their perspective, right? In Frankenstein, we get a lot of different versions, okay? And they don't necessarily match up, right? So when the Frank story involves a narrator telling a story in the first person narration, it introduces this concept of the unreliable narrator, adding a layer of intrigue and questioning to the narrative. An unreliable narrator can either be knowingly lying or simply have a skewed perspective due to their own biases, their mental state, or lack of information. Do we see that in Frankenstein? For sure, we have very different characters, right? So some signs of unreliability in a novel includes contradictions in the narrative, withholding key information, specifically if it makes that person look more sympathetic and their enemy look less sympathetic. Does that make sense? Extreme self-justification, a little bit of that in this novel.
Yeah.
Obvious biases or prejudices, and mental instability or psychological issues. Would you call Victor Frankenstein a mentally stable individual?
No.
What about the monster?
No.
What about Robert Walton?
Kind of. Yeah.
Kind of, right? He's on the cusp. He's still young enough and naive enough that maybe he doesn't have as much baggage that he's dealing with, right? I also threw this up here just to make it super, super clear what we're talking about when we say something like first person, second person, third person in literature. I'm sure you all know this, but just to review. First person is when the narrative is someone telling their own story. I went to the lake and this happened, and then we did this, okay? A second person narrative is where they use words like you, your, very rarely used in great literature. In fact, I was trying to think of a good example, and probably the strongest example, assuming you guys still have these books. When I was a kid growing up in the 80s and early 90s, we had choose your own adventure stories, were super popular. You guys familiar with those? Okay, like literally we had parties where we all sat around and read choose your own adventure books, and you'd finish a book and then you'd swap with your neighbor, and we would just read all night long because I was a giant nerd. So in those kind of choose your own adventures, it's the second person narrative. It's you open the door and suddenly a mummy jumps out. What do you do? And then it gives you two choices. You do this or you do that, and then depending on what you choose, you go to that page, and then you continue your adventure until 9 out of 10 times you end up dead. You have to go back and retrace your steps to try to figure out how to live and survive. Okay? Oregon Trail, maybe, is another example of second person narrative. So we don't see a ton of this. It would be difficult to write like literature with a capital L this way. I'm sure there are some examples of it. I just couldn't think of any like real screaming examples off the top of my head. And then third person is the most typical thing that we see. That's where you have an omniscient narrator who is telling the story. He's not one of the characters, he's just someone telling the story. Tolkien. With The Hobbit would be a great example. He sometimes inserts himself into the story, but always as the narrator, never as a character. And most literature you'll find follows that. So if they say he, she, it, they, that's third person narration, okay? So the unreliable narrator is something that we get with when you have multiple accounts of first person. If you only have one account of first person, you kind of just have to take them at their word. There may be contradictions. You may not like the character. You may not believe the character. And that would be a bit of the unreliable narrator. But where we see it come out the very most usually is when you have opposing narratives and stories. And well, we saw this side, now let's hear this side kind of thing, which Frankenstein is a classic example of the unreliable narrator. Okay. Any questions on that? So let's talk about these different narrators that we have, starting with the one who narrates the bulk of the book, Victor Frankenstein. So when we talk about unreliable narrator, their biases and the things that they're influenced by are going to change how they narrate. So these are some things that I came up with, and if you have any that you want to add to the list, by all means. But things that he's influenced by is his own guilt and shame, fear, especially of being discovered, and fear of not being something great, right? Lots of fears. Emotional instability, check, check, check. Obsession, rage, justification, definitely a great example of victim mentality, and pride and arrogance. Any other thoughts of ways that Victor...
Glory?
Glory, yeah. He's in for his own glory, right? Any other ideas?
Ambition.
Ambition, yeah. Yeah, huge, unchecked ambition, right? That's a big theme in the novel.
Too much ambition.
Too much ambition without maybe enough guidance, right? Isolation, or like his extreme introverted nature, you could add on there, does affect his point of view. He doesn't like feedback, particularly critical feedback. Anyway, all those things. Let's look at the monster. So had we only Victor's perspective, this monster would remain a hideous and mysterious being, right? Like, I think, was it you, Lydia, who came walking in and said, I thought that he was this evil creature, and then I read this thing, I was like, well, wait, hang on. Is he, right? So he would be this being who commits murder for seemingly no reason, and Victor would be quite justified in his hatred for this monster, right? So my question is, what do we gain after reading the monster's perspective? Did it shift for you what the monster is and what Victor is after reading the monster's account? Yeah?
Definitely, for sure.
How so?
Because I kind of realized he's more, in a way, he's kind of more human than Victor is, in that he's more, I don't know, he's more like emotionally aware, and he's more caring about things, and he's actually, he can be a loving creature.
Yes.
And he can appreciate beautiful things, which we can't see in Victor.
Right. When we see Victor, who's a character we talked about, he's a character who isolates. Is the monster a character who wants innately to isolate? No. How
like
different, right? Yeah. Very different thing. Oh, sorry, Savannah and then Cosette.
I just noticed that, like, the Victor is more of, like, a monster because, like, he made decisions, like, decisions based on knowledge. Like, he had knowledge. He wasn't this ignorant person. While the monster, he was kind of ignorant at the beginning, and, like, some of his decisions were based off of ignorance, while Victor, like, he went on a straight path towards his own destruction. And,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had every opportunity, right, to not go that way. He was consciously chose that way, whereas the monster didn't have those same kind of opportunities. That's a great point, Cosette.
I think my perspective of the monster actually shifted a little more negatively because
Did it? Yeah.
because in the beginning, like, the monster smiles at him, which is really sad,
Yeah.
and then later you find out that he killed someone, and in my head I was like, well, he doesn't know what he's doing, you know? That was my justification for him.
Yes.
But then through this perspective, I'm like, oh, he did know what he was doing. And, like, I understand where he's coming from through this narrative. Like, he doesn't feel like he's accepted in this species at all, so why would he care about them? But it also was like, I was like, okay, he's not just stupid and accidentally killing people. Like, he's,
Yeah, you kind of hoped he was, right?
yeah.
And then there was some more maliciousness. Let's have Eleanor and then Hegel. Yeah.
Yeah, I had something similar where, so when he first talks in the book,
Uh-huh.
it kind of scared me, right? Because I'm like, oh, he's not like, he killed this kid, and clearly he's intelligent enough to speak, so,
Yeah.
like, it humanized him a bit for me,
Yeah.
right? But then again, with this, what she was saying, like, when it goes back to the monster's perspective, it almost dehumanizes him a little bit more for me, like, above it.
Yeah.
Like, before he was below human intelligence, and then he almost seems like he definitely thinks he's above human, like, life. So, yeah, that was just...
It's an
Something
interesting
we see in
shift, isn't it?
Victor,
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Which is something we see in Victor.
Those two. Remember we were learning about archetype, and we talked about the archetype of the monster? The monster is always meant to reflect something human within the person that they were reflecting. Like a monstrous side of humanity, so to speak. Hazel.
One of the comparisons between the two that I recognized this week
Uh-huh.
was how Victor is constantly, except when for like the 6 years, however long he was at school,
Yeah.
he's always surrounded by people who love him. And like just like love him
Yeah.
and spend time with him and love his company. And he is kind of miserable always. He just always has this like underlying emo
Emo. Yeah.
personality.
Almost a goth person.
Yeah. Very much. I mean, you're down in the crypt.
Where the creature, like, Victor is guilty. He is guilty, and he is surrounded by love and by people. And the creature, mostly at the beginning, like when he's like first like hiding in his little hovel,
Yeah.
he is completely innocent. He hasn't done anything, and he's completely isolated and ostracized and all alone.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Which changes him, right, as a being, and we're gonna talk about specifically in his own words what happened to him there. So the monster, here's a short list of things that he's influenced by: rejection. He's talking about suffering, isolation, experience, and even literature. Even the monster benefited from good literature. Okay, and we're gonna dive really deep into the literature that influenced him today. Robert Walton. So he adds a third layer to this perspective. Very sympathetic to Victor, right? Robert is influenced by loneliness, ambition, his own inexperience, and even social class status, right? Like he's so lonely on a ship full of people. They weren't worthy of him. So we see that prejudice that we see in Victor too play out. So my question is of these three, which narrative do you feel is the most trustworthy? Robert, the monster, or which one? You said Robert? Huh?
Robert, I would do the monster, except for he's now articulate, and I'm like, I don't know, if you're smart enough to use those words that I have to look up a dictionary for, then maybe you're smart enough to be a little bit unreliable.
Interesting. So his eloquence almost threw you off the other version.
Yeah, for sure.
That's interesting. Frankenstein. Spin.
I kind of feel like the monster's kind of like sentient AI. In a way, it's just kind of like it seems like, you know, he's just created and he's like this innocent little thing, and then all of a sudden he like knows, and he wants. I feel like he wants you to trust him. And not anyone else.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't know. But I feel like Robert Walton would be the one that trusts you because he's trying to, I don't know, he's going on this big adventure to become a better person, and the other two, they're kind of, you know, they're just not doing good stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah. So because Robert maybe has less skin in the game, he's just saying, this is what I'm observing, this is what I'm seeing. And his interactions, mostly up to this point, have been just with Victor, right?
So he's a little less biased, I guess.
A little less biased, yeah. I would agree. Yeah.
I definitely agree that it's Robert because like he's not. You get the monster. He's telling his story for sympathy. Like his goal is to get sympathy and to like I guess gain something. And same with Victor is almost like warning almost, but like in a way that makes him seem like an innocent like bystander.
Yeah.
And then Robert, he's writing a letter to his sister. He is like telling her like, I'm not gonna go to my brother and tell him a story that's a lie. Like I'm like gonna write a like story to him and be like, this is really cool. What happened? Like, so he's like more I guess reliable because he's like telling it to someone that he trusts and like values.
Yeah. Good. Eleanor.
Just one or two things why I think Robert Walton isn't necessarily reliable.
Yeah, please.
First of all, I think he relates a lot to Victor
Uh-huh.
and his ambitions, and in the beginning he's kind of like, oh, I want a friend, but like he also seems to kind of isolate himself a little as well.
Uh-huh.
But then also a lot of the first part of the story is being told through Victor to Robert Walton, who's then telling it to us.
Yeah.
And I think, first of all, you have the person here. It's a lot easier to relate to a person that you can see.
Yes.
And then also, he's like being told a story, like it could be twisted even farther into Victor's point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. This is an interesting place to leave it, and I want to come back to Robert Walton as the reliable narrator in the story after you've finished volume 3. Okay, because we're going to circle back to him. And I'll be curious what your thoughts are as things develop. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 novels that influenced the monster. This starts on page 130. It's chapter 7 in volume 2, where he kind of talks about this. So he says, one night, I found on the ground, this is the monster speaking, I found on the ground a leathern portmanteau containing several articles of dress and some books. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, the books were written in the language of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories, whilst my friends, that would be the declare, why am I not saying their name right? The Lacey's, I'm like, it's not quite, were employed in their ordinary occupations. I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. Which, by the way, this is not one of the questions that I put down specifically, but it would be interesting to answer, how does literature affect the monster in this story, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today. Okay, so I want to look at these 3 books. Remember we talked about the great conversation. The more well-read you are, the more you'll understand other books. Okay, Mary Shelley is not subtle in her use of literature within literature, right? And this would be another example of it. So understanding at least the background of these stories that affected our monster is important. The first one is The Sorrows of Werther by Goethe, okay? Goethe is a German philosopher and writer. He, people usually say Goethe, okay, but it's Goethe. And it's written Werther or Werther, but in Germany anyway. You pronounce the TH as a tough sound. And it would actually be Werther, because the W is a V. You don't need to know that. But he's most famous for Faust. Maybe some of you heard of his play Faust. In fact, I often see lines from Faust quoted, and it says by Faust, and I was like, no. It's not by Faust. Faust is the doctor that the play is about. And I see it all the time.
Is Faust the one where it's like the doctor who sells his soul?
Yes. Yes. Yep, you're on the right track. Yes, which is also sort of a Paradise Lost vibe to it, right? Anyway, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe tells the story of a sensitive young man named Werther who becomes deeply enamored with a woman named Charlotte, but is unable to pursue her because she's already engaged to another man. His unrequited love, coupled with his inability to reconcile his passionate emotions with societal constraints, ultimately leads him to suicide, as depicted through a series of letters he writes to a friend detailing his despairing journey. Can we understand how this might affect the monster? Okay. The novel subtly critiques the rigid social structures of the time, highlighting the constraints placed on individuals like Werther, who were not part of the aristocracy. So Werther was an outsider, and because he was an outsider, he felt that he would not have the chance to love the woman that he liked. The monster on this novel said specifically, in the sorrows of Werther, besides the interests of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto been to me obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. Further down he's going to say, I thought Werther himself a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sunk deep. The disquisitions upon death and suicide were calculated to fill me with wonder. I did not pretend to enter into the merits of the case, yet I inclined towards the opinions of the hero, whose extinction I wept without precisely understanding it. Okay, he was deeply affected by Werther's sorrows and by his decision ultimately to end his life. Let's go look at our next one. Plutarch's Lives. Those of you who have done Ambleside are probably familiar with this. Plutarch's Lives, also known as Parallel Lives, is a collection of biographies that compares famous Greeks and Romans. The work explores the influence of character on history and the role of morality in public life. So Plutarch would compare, he would take someone out of Greek history and then someone out of Roman history, it's nonfiction, and he would compare the two. Like the founder of Greece and the founder of Rome. He would compare the two, and kind of, by comparing the two, you could understand what makes a great leader and some of the foibles and follies of leadership that we have witnessed historically, okay? Plutarch's work is rich with anecdotes and details, and he often drew parallels between physical appearance and character. We understand how that would affect the monster in this book. Okay, and then finally, the one we're going to really dig in on most is Paradise Lost, because we know that the fall of Adam is a theme throughout the entire book. Creation, the relationship between creator and created. So Paradise Lost by John Milton is an epic poem, about 11,000 lines if you want to pick it up for some light reading, that tells the story of Adam and Eve's fall from grace. It also includes the creation of the world and the rebellion of Satan, and I would say Satan is a big part of Paradise Lost. In fact, some people have even speculated that Satan is the protagonist in some ways in Paradise Lost. Not a perfect protagonist, but there's more of a sympathetic creature in Milton's Satan. The primary themes explored in John Milton's Paradise Lost include, this might sound familiar, free will and predestination, the nature of good and evil, disobedience and revolt, pride, the consequences of choice, love and marriage, hierarchy and order, and the fall of man, with a central focus on the conflict between God's absolute power and the human desire for autonomy, often depicted through the characters of Satan, Adam, and Eve. Okay, so this is a book that really affects our creature, and he's going to refer to it in subtle ways down the road. So of the three books, I wanted to spend a little more time on this. I actually found a video. It's hard to find a video on Paradise Lost that isn't at least 30 minutes long, because it's just a long epic poem. And at the time that it was written when epic poems were being written about Greek heroes. Like you'd have things traditionally like Beowulf or Homer with the Odyssey and the Iliad, those kinds of things. So for him to write an epic poem on the Christian myth, meaning the creation of Christianity and where it came from, it was quite a bold move at the time in Protestant England where this was written, and particularly his take on some of the things. So when we, I'm going to use a phrase that my professor used talking about John Milton. John Milton was the creator of the sexy Satan. Okay, the original idea that Satan wasn't just like some hobbled demon, but was a beautiful creature, had potential for greatness, and was a very, very persuasive and interesting person before he fell from heaven. Okay, so I did find a video. It's about 9 minutes long. It's pretty entertaining, actually. And you'll have to excuse me. The guy's voice is weird. I'm just going to warn you, it's a weird voice. But this video is specifically on Paradise Lost and how it interplays with Frankenstein. So that's why I think it's doubly worth watching, okay? So, assuming it pops up, yes.
The volume of Plutarch's Lives, which I possessed, contains the histories of the first founders of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me from The Sorrows of Werther. I learned from Werther's imaginations despondency
So this is the monster
and gloom,
telling what
but
this book was to
Plutarch
him.
taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections, to admire and love the heroes of past ages. This episode is brought to you by The Great Courses Plus. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/extra credits to start your 1-month free trial. Plutarch's Lives is the book that makes Frankenstein's monster realize that there is more to life than his wretched state. It's the book that lets him understand the potential for greatness in humanity, and thus in himself.
Sorry, it's playing the wrong one. I must have embedded the wrong one. They were back to back. And sometimes when it finishes, it plays out. I thought I double checked that. As you guys can tell at this point, technology is not my strongest forte in the world.
He got his CM or something, and he's like a clean cut.
Okay, while we're pulling that up, let me ask the question. Why do you think it's important that the monster learned from literature in this novel?
He wasn't gonna learn from people.
Don't take my word for it.
And why is that?
It's like something.
Because he's ugly.
Well, yeah, he couldn't go out and observe them.
So do you think that was a way for him to have an unbiased education in some ways?
Yes.
I also think that maybe if he had gone out and seen just the common people, he wouldn't have gotten the same impressions at all. As, like, studying the heroes of old versus, like, the random villagers, like, everyday Joe.
Yeah.
I thought it was funny. He was like, they like such beautiful and delicate, like, just commoners, and then you realize that they're not commoners like every other beautiful and delicate person in the entire book. It's like, oh.
Insert video. I did. I
It's
had
looking
no-
disappointing to be like, oh.
I know.
They're like,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, he finds a nice little peasant family, and I was like, and it's like, and they were nobles, but
Yeah. Here's their epic story.
I was
Aw.
like, that's beautiful, Shelly.
Yeah. Oh, girl, your bias is coming out. Put that away.
Is that guy sweating or is he melting?
Oh!
He's burning.
He's
He's
It
on
looks
fire.
like
Okay.
No, he's just really
His
smart.
eyes look.
What a world.
What a world. That's right. Oh, whoops. I
this
moved
one
him.
is, I think, our source.
I did not mean to move him.
I think that's
I
actually
love Lions in the Wizard of Oz. The one that is like famous.
Okay, let's try this again. I'm hoping this means there won't be ads in it.
Fingers crossed.
Wait, why is it not? Oh, it's because I'm trying to play it. I have to play it on this screen. Don't freak out on me now! Well, I might have to post this so you guys might have to watch it. Because it's being kind of obnoxious. Okay, if I post it, will you guys promise to watch it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll try.
Okay, let's talk about some of the. I don't know why it's being
I
weird.
want to watch it.
Let's just try.
You could go to YouTube.
Yeah, I'm just trying to avoid that. I gotta kill this, is what I gotta do.
Kill the monster.
Die. Okay.
Sorry,
And then
kill the
we
monster.
get it back on my screen. Okay. Oh, I think we're gonna get it, guys. I think we're gonna get it.
What?
Huh?
I'm gonna go
Okay, I
run
gotta
into
drag it over here.
5 miles.
Go full screen. And play.
Yes.
Wait.
You spoke too soon.
Where's the sound?
Dang it, bro.
Where's the movement?
Let's just not play.
Where's the video?
Let's do that silent thing again. Why does it do that? Whoops, nope, not that. Why are you at the same spot? Oh,
Click
you
the
guys.
3 dots. Exit slideshow. That's the slideshow play.
Where's it? It's like-
Cut.
And that brings us back to this. Which I don't understand why it's not.
Just look silent and click it on.
No, it's not me. Oh,
And the other volumes which had fallen into my hands. As a true history, it
oh, okay. Yeah, I agree with it.
Paradise Lost
There
excited
we go.
different and far deeper
I love
emotions.
post-it
I read it as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations, as their similarities
I like
struck me,
his
to my
diaper versus the
own.
leaf.
Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from
There's
beings
a lot of
of a
bums in this
superior
class, I'm
nature,
sorry.
but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me.
So that's what he said about the novel.
This episode is brought to you by The Great Courses Plus. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/extra credits to start your 1-month free trial. To fully understand what Shelley is trying to tell us about the monster in Frankenstein by associating him with Satan in Paradise Lost, there's something you have to know about Milton's great work. You see, many have argued that Satan is actually the protagonist in Paradise Lost, even though Milton would not explicitly come out and say it. One of the great espousers of this theory was proto-romantic William Blake, and this idea was all the rage amongst the Romantics. Shelley would have almost certainly thought of the character of Satan in these terms. You see, in Paradise Lost, it's easy to see Satan's character as the great advocate of freedom, the rebellious symbol of liberty. It's from him that we get that immortal line, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." I mean, swap in some different proper nouns, that line could come from any number of hero characters resisting oppression. Because to him, being free of all yokes is worth any price. In the book, Satan is zealous, courageous, bold, loyal to those who have been loyal to him, but most of all, no matter what the cost, he is single-mindedly opposed to surrendering to the will of heaven, to unquestioningly obeying orders given to him. By associating the monster with Satan, what Shelley is hinting to her reader is that, much like the devil in Paradise Lost, the protagonist in her book may not be who you expect. It may not be the human fashioned in divine image, but rather the creature whose physical form, we are told, is a mockery of such. And it's from Milton's portrayal of Satan that I believe Shelley drew the inspiration for some of the monster's most notable features, principally among them his power of speech. Like Satan, the monster in Frankenstein is more articulate and more eloquent than any other character in the story. For both characters, their outer appearance belies their inner thoughtfulness and their ability to express grand ideas. Frankenstein's monster is a grotesque creature cobbled together from the corpses of the dead, and Satan was made hideous by being cast into hell before Paradise Lost even begins. And yet, in each case, the wars they fight are already lost. In each case, they are fighting a war that they have no chance to overcome. One of them fights God, the other one fights human nature. And yet, as you read, these characters manage to convince you that there might yet be hope for their cause, that there might be some way yet unseen to find success, even though, by the very nature of the works they exist in, we know these characters have lost long before their battles even begin. And through those lost causes and their eloquence, both characters seduce the reader into overlooking the evil in their nature. For they do both share that same consuming flaw, the desire for vengeance. When Satan realizes that he's lost his war with heaven, he says, "What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome?" And Shelley plays with the monster's knowledge of Paradise Lost, making the monster see just how similar he is to Milton's Satan, having the monster describe his own killing frenzy by saying, "Evil thenceforth became my good." Nearly a direct quote of Satan's words, "All good to me is lost. Evil be thou my good." In that moment, Shelley is trying to make us realize that these are not heroes to emulate, but rather heroes to pity. Her book is not an adventure, or even a horror story. It's a tragedy. A tragedy of human weakness, of lofty moral hopes dashed upon petty and sordid ground. And just like the juxtapositions in Plutarch, the parallel between Satan and the monster forces us to consider another juxtaposition. For if the monster so clearly mirrors Milton's Satan, then is Victor Frankenstein supposed to mirror Milton's God? Because, he doesn't. And that comparison serves to make us realize just how weak and unfit a creator Frankenstein is. He is not omnipotent. In fact, a mere fright leaves him laid up in bed for months. And whenever his emotions overwhelm him, he's consumed by delirium and fever. He doesn't even comprehend the responsibilities of fatherhood or creation. He abandons the life he brought into being the instant he sees how ugly it is. And in that too, we see how unlike Milton's God Victor is. For Milton's God creates creatures in his own image, whereas Frankenstein, in his haste to see his hopes fulfilled, creates a creature that is a mockery of his image. But these characters are similar in one way. Neither Milton's God nor Shelley's Victor Frankenstein are self-critical enough to see that they are hurting the very beings who they're supposed to be responsible for. Both of these books are infused with the same sense that these creators could have easily averted this tragedy that unfolds had their characters been just slightly different. And in both of these works, the created perpetuate that tragedy. This is what makes the tragedy of Frankenstein so effective. From the outside, as readers, as observers, we can see how easily these tragedies might have been avoided. And yet, we can also see how completely impossible avoiding them actually is. The book asks us to look at our own lives through this lens. Where have we let our natures lead us to tragedies that might have easily been avoided? That we could have prevented if we were aware and willing enough to take a step back and, for just a moment, act beyond our nature. Lastly, though, there is one more tragedy embedded in the monster's association with Satan, and that is that he himself knows which character he's like. He knows who he is, but he wants to be more. It's clear that he wants to be Adam, with a loving creator who builds for him a paradise and helps guide him through life. And we're forced to think, at least in part, that it's out of this yearning, this desire to be Adam, that the monster emulates Adam and demands a mate. The action that ultimately brings everybody to ruin. Because the monster is not Adam, and Victor isn't God. And so all of this knowledge, everything the monster learns about humanity as an outsider peering in, leads him to say one telling line. He says, "Increase in knowledge only discovered to me more clearly what a wretched outcast I was." That is the true tragedy of Frankenstein. The monster has all of the building blocks of a great individual, and yet he is very literally built in such a way that the world won't let him be. Hey, you seem Paradise Lost, excited, different, and far deeper emotions.
Okay. Alright, so that gives us a better background of what Paradise Lost and the fall of Adam and all that is so important to this book. So Milton's story is a take on a biblical story. It doesn't line up. Like every character in Milton's version is flawed. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that's the correct biblical reading of it, but that is Milton's version, and that's the version that they're taking here in this book. So I want to take the next, oh good, we've got about 3 minutes, that's what we need to really talk about this, to talk about volume 2. So you can pull that open. Chapter 1 we'll probably mostly skip over. This is the family is grieving over the deaths, and Victor goes back to his place of comfort, which is like solitude, nature, those kinds of things. I'm trying to think if there's anything that anyone's like really excited to talk about in chapter 1, that's great. Otherwise we'll jump into chapter 2 where there's a lot to discuss. So chapter 2 will begin on page 99 in your novels. This is Victor. He's up hiking in solitude in nature in Mount Blanc when Frankenstein encounters his creature. And the creature basically comes to Frankenstein and begs him to listen to his tale. Okay? And I want to jump, one of the real key moments in this book happens in this chapter, starting on page 102. And this is where the two meet and actually have an exchange for the first time. Because up to this point, the monster has not been able to speak or communicate with Frankenstein. So Frankenstein sees the monster, and in that first paragraph there on 102, he says, "Devil," I exclaim, "do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect," which I think is just a great insult you should keep in your back pocket. "Begone, vile insect. Or rather, stay that I may trample you to dust, and oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered."
Wait, what page is this?
This is on page 102.
Alright.
And then the monster speaks. "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." I want to pause here. Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you. This talk of duty and parenthood, does it remind you of anything else earlier in the novel?
When Victor's parents were good parents.
Yeah. In Victor's own words, right? This is on page 35 if you want to cross-reference it. But on page 35, this is Victor describing his own relationship with his parents. He said, "I was their plaything and their idol and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good and whose future lot was in their hands, to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me." That's a very, very different perspective than what the monster has experienced, right? So now Victor goes on to him and says, "Abhorred monster, fiend that thou art, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come on then, that I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another." Now, how the monster responds to this, Victor's obviously just like out of control, right? At this point, he's like, "I'm going to kill you with my bare hands. You fiend, you devil, you insect." And how does the monster respond? Be calm. Who's in control of their emotions in this moment?
The monster.
The monster. That's an interesting observation. Porter.
I think something that's interesting is that the first paragraph that the monster's speaking, he's not really in control of his emotions. He's like, "I'm gonna kill your friends if you don't do it."
That's a fair point, right? That's a fair point.
They both start the conversation by saying, "I'm gonna kill you. How could you how could you kill my friends? I'm gonna kill you now." Then the monster's like, "How could you kill people? I'm gonna kill your friends."
Yeah. Yeah.
They're like, "Don't kill people. I'm gonna kill you now."
It's kind of rage in Victor and then like emotional manipulation in the monster.
Yes.
Physical manipulation, right?
Yeah, I feel
Is that
like
what you're
it's
saying?
like you realize, oh, this isn't gonna go the way I want it to, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna just try and deceive him and manipulate him.
Yeah. You were my creator, but I'm in control now.
Yeah,
Do your duty towards me, or everybody's dead, right? So be calm, I entreat you. Did you have a thought? Oh. I entreat you to hear me before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. This is how the monster sees himself, as a devoted creation. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember that thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. This is that kind of trying to control the situation again. My height is superior to thine. Another great line, guys. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, which thou owest me. And he goes on to say, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. So my question is this: do you believe him?
No.
What he says here? No? Why not?
Because I think he's trying to, I think just like him praising him after he just was, cursing him. It's
Yeah.
just another thing of he's trying to manipulate him and take power over him.
Yeah, good. So he's that manipulation where he's like, do it my way or the highway, but I'm devoted to you.
Yeah.
That's very contradictory, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
As a creature. And again, if we go back to Milton's Paradise Lost, who is it that's trying to control God and say, well, I will do this if you do it my way? We see again that parallel. Good. Other thoughts? Because that.
I did think it was interesting. It seemed to be a commentary on how people are excited about God when they feel like he's blessing them. And then Victor is obviously not a good comparison to God at all, but just the way the monster is, he's like, if you'll like give me what I want, then I'll obey you. And I just thought that was interesting.
That's a very interesting observation. So this is kind of a theme of rebellion, that we see that as long as you do it my way, and as long as things go the way I want it to, I will obey you. But if you don't, that's far from rebellion. I will kill everybody, everybody you love.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty harsh daddy issues with rebellion right there, right? that goes pretty extreme. Good. Other thoughts on that before we move on? Yeah.
In that paragraph where the monster's talking, he says, where he's talking about he should be as Adam, he said, where is it? Oh, I was benevolent and good, misery made me a thing. And then in a few more paragraphs, he says he's benevolent again.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, he's convinced that he was good, but that he knows he's become a bad creature, and he understands that he's evil.
Good. So he sees this as, I had potential for good, man made me what it is. How does this fit in with our theme of self-justification from the novel?
Frankenstein, or the monster, always had a choice if he was going to be kind or not to people. And so, like, even though people, like, cast him out, nobody ever actually, at least was able to hurt him in a serious way.
Mm-hmm.
I guess he did get shot, but, like,
That's just small thing.
but he ends up, like, killing some kid who just thinks he's ugly, right? And you see that at one point he decides that he wants to make people miserable more than he wants to try and fit in with them.
Good. Yeah. Good. Savannah.
I noticed throughout the book all the time, like, Frankenstein says, like, things like, and this was a turning moment where the fates were against me or whatever. Like, he's blaming fate for all the things that he did, and I'm just like, are you stupid? That was you, not fate.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like the mist just created this monster. You use your hands, you went into graveyards, you dissected human bodies, and you made this monster, not fate.
Right.
Yeah.
There is no free will. It was fate. Had my father only said this, I wouldn't have done the action. Had this only happened, right? And then, yes. Good. Hazel.
I do believe he's justified in being angry.
Mhm.
The creature's very justified in that. But then he just, like, he goes way too far. He keeps just being like, I saved a girl from drowning and her dad or this man shot me. That's horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And then he meets he meets the brother of his enemy, and instead of just being like, oh, I hate you, kills him, and then goes even
Rage, yeah.
further and purposely frames Justine, which I was like,
And why? Why does he choose to frame Justine? Do you remember?
because he can never have, and no one will ever look at him. He can't have a woman.
Yeah, basically, yeah. She's too beautiful, she'll never love me, therefore she deserves to die.
Yeah.
Good. Did I see your hand, Porter?
Just answering your question of like
That made
self-justification. That's what.
Yeah.
All the characters try and put their blame on others,
Mm-hmm.
and
Agreed.
like even from the second Victor creates the monster, he could have been nicer. From the second he sees it, he leaves and he's like, oh no, what am I to do? And then he just blames it on other people. And then the monster blames it on other people. Like everyone just is like, I'm not in charge of my actions. It's
Yes.
other people doing it to me.
Big theme in the book, right? It's not me, it's other people that are in charge of my actions. Good. Savannah.
I just remembered something when Hazel said, like, was talking about Justine and how he framed her because she didn't love him. That's like a difference between Frankenstein and like the monster. Frankenstein is so vain, and his opinion of his like cousin, his opinion of her is like that she's his object, his
Yes.
like toy, and she loves him because like he's this amazing person is what he thinks of himself. And then the monster's like, you're not gonna love me because I'm an ugly person. I haven't even given you the opportunity to see if you might love me, but I'm gonna kill you because of that. And like it's like vanity versus like, I don't know what to call that, like just anger, like yeah.
It's rage and revenge, and both are destructive powers
Yeah.
in the end, right? Good, we got a lot of hands. Let's go 1, 2, 3. Go ahead, Lydia.
Oh, it was kind of just what they were all saying, but with like being, it's, you know, like the unreliable narrator, because all of the characters, besides, I feel like Robert Watson, probably less, but they're all very biased towards themselves.
Yeah.
So they're trying to convince you, the reader, to sympathize them and that they are right. So it's interesting reading the different perspectives and kind of, because you can definitely like see that throughout the book and trying to like recognize, okay, so that's them trying to gain sympathy and not necessarily true.
Yeah. Do you think that's human nature?
Yeah.
Do you think we all do that to some degree? Don't we tend to be more sympathetic to our cause sometimes than other people's causes? Why is that, do you think?
Because we're humans, we love ourselves.
Yeah.
We're talking about, someone mentioned, so Eleanor, that when you have a conversation with someone face to face, you're naturally gonna be more empathetic and sympathetic than someone who you haven't met that you're hearing the story about, right? Like, I know that like when my good friend says, oh, my neighbor did this, I'm like, ooh, what a terrible, nasty person. I've never met this person, right?
Yeah.
But I feel that. But there's something about the more you know someone, their whole perspective, the more that you're gonna have empathy for them. How well do we know ourselves? Hopefully pretty well.
Yeah.
We all lack some self-awareness, right? But we understand at least our motives better than other people do, and we're less likely to villainize ourselves within than we are to externally villainize others.
Yeah, there's like this saying that there's 3 sides to every story. Your side, their side, and the truth. Like
And we see that here, right? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle between these two, because we have these two beings. We have Victor and the monster, who are both creating terrible destruction, death, misery for everyone around them, but they're both innocent. How does that work, right? Good. Other thoughts? Yeah, Brent.
Follow up on like what Porter said earlier. I feel like shoot, I just went blank. Anyways, no.
Sorry, I made you hold that
Sure,
comment for a while.
no.
No, you're okay.
Well, the next thing I was gonna say was, I feel like, oh no, yeah, I got it. So yeah, I feel like, I mean, it is Victor's fault. Like, he created this thing, and instead of loving it for who it was and maybe trying to turn it around, he kind of let it do its thing. So, I mean, it is his fault that, I feel like it's his fault what's going on, and he may be trying to get rid of it, which I think is good, but I feel like he's like taking that blame away from him when really it's his fault. And then the follow up, and then also I feel like the monster's kind of doing the same thing in the sense that he feels like he's not like a being, or he counts himself as not something.
Yeah.
He feels like I was created by man or this Victor, and so my actions aren't my actions. They're is because he created me, and so it's not my problem, it's his. So.
Yeah, I'm an extension of him, which speaks to Victor's personality in general. Like we were talking about Elizabeth, she's his possession. She's an extension of him. His friends and things, they're all just extensions of him in his narcissistic, egotistical way. But when it comes to the monster, he completely abandons it.
Yeah.
Do you think if Victor had done his duty to the monster would have become different? Or do you think that was its innate nature eventually to go this way?
it would have become different.
And they would have become different? Why?
100%, yeah.
Because like with that guidance, like I guess with the guidance and a little bit of sympathy, the monster would have been able to like I don't know.
He could have actually become a decent person,
Yeah.
but not having any of that guidance, he just had to learn off of other behaviors that he'd seen and go off of his own judgment, which he probably didn't have very like good judgment because he didn't have any like thing influencing him.
Good. So that isolation and rejection is what did it. Good. Oh, lots of hands. Let's go. Porter, Cosette, Eleanor.
So I think that because all the monster had ever experienced was hatred. Everyone just hated him. So that's all he knew. But then once he got the books, he knew of the other things. But he initially all he knew was hatred because he was ugly. I think it's interesting. A lot of times, like almost every story, the villain in whatever is meant to symbolize bad is ugly and hideous.
Yeah.
And I think that is because we use ugly things as like evil. We tend to like treat ugly things as bad.
Yeah.
And so then the monster is like, okay, I guess I'm bad. And so, but if Victor had initially been kind to him, then he would have known that kindness was what was right.
Yeah.
And it would be a completely different story.
You bring up a really interesting point. This idea of, as humans, do we reject things that we find ugly for things that we find beautiful? Is that human nature? So let me give an example. If you're in your yard and a ladybug or a butterfly lands on your arm, how do you react? Okay, if you're in your yard and a grasshopper or a worm lands on your arm, how do you react?
Worm, I don't care.
Is it?
Like a cockroach?
And there can be different things.
Or
Or
land on your arm.
I would say a spider, like maybe daddy long, like a spider that can't harm you. Is that comfortable? Or is that an uncomfortable thing with it? Even if it can't hurt you. Why is that?
I feel like we kind of ascribe beauty to things that we like. I feel like it might be a little bit the other way too. Because like, if you think about spiders and ladybugs, right? They're both bugs. They got a lot of little legs and they look kind of funny looking, like objectively. But we think of ladybugs as pretty or whatever, and I don't know that they're inherently more beautiful than spiders. I think that we are freaked out about spiders though because ladybugs have like help kill aphids, and spiders can kill you. So
if you get the wrong one, right?
Yeah,
so with spiders, there's like, the wrong kind of spider can be problematic. Snakes too, right? Some are harmless, some are not.
right, because when I think about it hard, I don't really find spiders ugly. I think they're about the same level as ladybugs, but I do think that I would initially say that ladybugs are prettier just because I ascribe more positive emotions towards them in general.
Sure. That's fair. Eleanor, you had a comment?
Yeah, so I was just saying earlier, we were talking about how if he had been raised in more of a understanding and like sympathetic thing, he would have turned out different.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is corresponding to the way that Frankenstein was raised in the way that he was raised by the professors. Originally, the first professor, he was spurned, kind of, and then he hated that professor. Versus after he got some sympathy from the second one, and like, even though he was basically saying the same thing, he said them not in the same way at all.
His description was so different, right?
Right. And then if the monster had been raised in more of a sympathetic thing, maybe he wouldn't have immediately been like, oh, this is my enemy. Which he did for Frankenstein.
Good point. I know I skipped you. Let's go Savannah, Jess will leave soon, and then Cosette.
I actually don't believe really super.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. Go ahead.
Anyway, just back to the ugly part. Like me and my sister were kind of talking about something like this the other day. Like we were talking about like how, like I just said like beauty like in some cases is in the eye of the beholder and what they're used to and their surroundings. And Ellie was like, and I just made a comment about how beautiful my hair was, and Ellie was like, well, if everyone in the world was bald, your hair would be the ugliest thing on earth. I was like, yeah, so maybe it's like what we're used to around like us, like because everybody else like has hair, like we can see it as something beautiful. But like if only 1% of the world had hair, Ellie was like, everyone would see them as ugly, and I'm like, that's an interesting thought. Like it really would And so like with the monster like looking so different, like all these people, they become afraid of it because like it's not what they're used to and not what they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Which like even in some cases things that could be considered like things that are actually naturally beautiful could be ugly to us because we're afraid of it.
Yeah. It's a good point. And we see that culturally where different cultures, different things are considered beautiful, right? Very, very different. Cosette, and then Preston. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I don't know, with the monster being raised in a better environment, if, like, I think he would have been maybe a little less murderous, probably.
Hopefully.
But also you look at Victor, and Victor was raised in a lovely environment, you know?
Yeah.
Victor was raised in the ideal place, his parents doted on him, and he turned out to be a monster. And then, with what Eleanor was saying with the professors, like, even though one was mean, like, he avoided that professor, and he didn't like him, but the other one didn't turn him towards good either. Like, Victor, was kind of a bad apple from the start, and the monster, he has some negative characteristics that I don't feel like he just picked up. Like, the way he's kind of manipulative, the way that, he's, like, murderous. I don't feel like he necessarily just got those by watching other people, and so I kind of, I don't know, I take him being raised, like, with a grain of salt. I feel like maybe he would not have turned out nice.
It's a really interesting question because it comes back to the age-old question, nurture versus nature. Meaning, when a person is raised, how much of it is how they're raised and how much of it is innately just a part of them. And having raised 4 children, I'll tell you, nature is a strong force.
Yeah.
Like, you can't, you guys, on your own families, you can probably, like, your siblings are not going to be just like you. Everybody kind of comes with their own thing, even if they grew up in the same environment. I have a twin sister. I've raised twins. That's as close as you can get to, like, replicating nature. Like, they grew up in a very similar life, because, like, the oldest to youngest child, that's going to be different no matter what. But with twins, my sister is completely opposite from me, and I would argue Ben and Will have a lot of differences as well, right? So it is an interesting question, nature versus nurture. So what is the nature of the monster, and where does that meet his isolation and rejection? We do have isolation in both characters, but it's interesting to note that Victor's isolation is self-isolated. The monster's is he was isolated by society. Let's go Preston and then Eleanor.
It's just interesting to see how this monster is like leagues more wise than Frankenstein is.
Yeah.
I mean, Frankenstein, he's very learned, but it's only in like the ways of man, like the way they discovered the world. But with Frankenstein, he kind of studies man and is able to kind of learn from experience and is able to go off of that. So honestly, I think his isolation was almost kind of healthy in a way. There were definitely more cons than pros. But it was interesting to see how this monster was able to become almost human despite his appearance, which kind of goes back to like the whole evil equals ugly type thing. And I think it's interesting to see how Mary Shelley can illustrate that good can come from the most unexpected of places.
Yeah.
And evil can come from an expected place almost always.
Yeah. It's a really interesting idea. You bring up this idea of intelligence, that this monster, in some ways, very arguably was more intelligent than Victor. Certainly more socially intelligent, right? As far as like caring for people and being aware that other people have feelings or exist outside of himself. Right, and then, anyway, that was a great point. I had another thought as you were saying that and it left me. Who? Eleanor.
Sorry, just one thing I remembered I was gonna say. It's we've moved on, but
that's all right. Let's go back.
I'm just gonna jump back really fast. When they were talking about the devil and when he's talking about himself, he's saying like I was their child, somebody that God had given them. Like I was somebody that God had given them to raise. Versus this, Frankenstein, he's like, go back to hell where you belong.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so that just was a comparison I noticed.
Yeah, that's a great thing to point out. That is a huge difference, right? As far as, and the monster himself questions that. He says, I'd like to think of myself as Adam, but at times I think that I am the fallen angel, right? So even the monster has his own self-perception that aligns with that. Good, Hazel.
This is just throughout the week as I was reading. It's just from the monster's perspective. It's like from the outside view, you can see how easily so many of these things could have been prevented. Hence the tragedy. And one of them is I feel like the creature would have worshipped Victor, and that is like the main reason Victor made him.
That's what he wanted, right?
He was like this new species to worship me and love me, and I will be this great person, and da 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 da. I'll be a god.
Yeah.
And like so many times in the book, the creature's like, "Where's my creator? Where is he?"
I would be
I'm
your
like,
devoted servant.
Yeah, and then like so many points, like just like little things he says, I'm just like, oh, he would like, who knows down the road, been like, why did you make me with the crap? So many things, but like when he's first made, when he's young, he would have fulfilled Victor's wishes.
Yeah, yeah. That's page 55 that you're referencing. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs.
And then, yeah, and then
That's a
because,
major God complex.
and then because of his own thing, he is like, I remembered Adam's supplication to his creator, but where's mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. So like the opposite happened because of his own.
Yeah, it's a complete conversion or perversion of the nature of God, right?
Yeah.
It got flipped on its head.
Yeah, I feel like if he would have just, nurtured him at first, that the thing would have grown fun just like a baby. He was just like innocent little thing where, he just doesn't. It's just like a baby. He's born like he needed to learn, but instead he left him, and then he kind of, I feel like, found out for himself doing that humans are like these disgusting little things, and that he should, even though he doesn't want to now he doesn't want to be one of them. He wants to kind of be something else.
Yeah.
And kind of overpower them in a way.
Yeah. He wants to control them and he's like, all right, if you're not going to treat me this way, then I'm just going to, because he has the ability. He says, I'm taller than you, I'm stronger than you. In some ways, I could be the ruler over you. Which comes from a place of really, we see people, like the classic school bully, right? We know that comes from a place usually of hurt, right? They're angry because they're hurt, and then we see that come out. They're going to try to control the situation, be the most powerful person by hurting other people and putting them down. Good. Let's
Okay. It's kind of interesting because you just add a couple of tweaks to this story, and it would be something totally different.
It's like if, tragic, huh?
It's heart-rending, and I think that's kind of the whole point. Like, if Frankenstein had stuck around, and been a good, dare I say, dad, then he probably could have accomplished what he sought out to do. Like, he could have created a new species. They probably could have made their own country and been like another human race. But instead, he decides to just run away from his creation, and I think it shows like an example of like ownership. Like, if you're going to do something, you should own up to it. You should take responsibility and raise your hand if it's you.
Yeah.
So even if it's good or bad, you need to realize what you've done, and you need to act accordingly in the best way you can.
Yeah. So it's that difference between free will, like you're saying, ownership versus what we've talked about, which is it's not my fault, it's someone else's fault. So, yeah, I agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head for like the theme of the book. If we had to do it, is what you're talking about right now. Savannah.
Can I just say, like, first I'm gonna talk about what he said. Can I just say, I am so frustrated that Frankenstein during, I can't remember her name, the girl that died. Justine. During her, like, whole trial, he was thinking to himself, he's like, how terrible that, like, my monster did this, but I'm not gonna say anything or do anything, because all these people think I'm mad. That just made me so mad. Like,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, so you know
It's
you're
infuriating.
responsible, but you're not doing anything about it. You're just gonna let this girl die because of you. It just frustrated me.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I also wanted to say that I don't think that evil was in in the monster's original nature.
Yeah.
I think he like us all had went through things and experienced things that eventually led him to be evil. But like at the beginning, he was more leaning towards good. Like he knew there were like 5 things that he or not 5, I don't know how many, but there were certain things he based his life off of, and one was that he saw these people and he saw that they were good and he saw that they could do good things, and thus he wanted to do good things too.
Yeah.
But then he also over time found that he was different, he was ugly, and because of that he would never be accepted as a good person, and because of that he so I don't think it was evil, his original nature was evil. I think because of certain foundational beliefs he became evil.
I tend to agree with you.
Wait,
I think
hold on. We're buying into Frankenstein's philosophy right here. Like we're placing.
we are.
We're
You're
placing
right.
the blame off Frankenstein. I mean, he could have made, even if he was raised in this hostile environment, he could have chosen good rather than saying, "I'm gonna act like all these other people around me."
It's true.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So it comes back to that theme of responsibility and ownership for our actions, right? That you're
Yeah.
talking about. Yeah.
Just
We're-
own it, guys. If you screw up,
Just
own
own it.
If you
That's what we can take from this.
Definitely.
We're out of time, but Hazel, I want to give you a chance to share your.
I just want to say, you can see, as there are moments of almost, you're like, is this who you really are? Thinking through your story of Rachel found the quote of, when he's over Justine, he's like, what does it even say? You're wake is first, thy lover is near.
Yeah. It's a little creepy, huh?
That was so
It's a little
disgusting.
Snow White, maybe.
You just murdered someone, and now you're gonna say this,
Yeah.
and
He's all over the
then
place.
blame her for murder.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard swing from pendulum from one side to the other.
He has a
Good.
lot of feelings.
I hope you guys continue to enjoy this novel. It's one of my very favorites. So volume 3 next week, we're gonna have a chance to discuss that, and then you're gonna get to write. It's just going fast.
Are
So
we gonna read the appendixes?
you
The extra
certainly can
stories?
if you want. In the front, I don't know if you noticed this, but if you have time, in the front is Mary Shelley's own introduction, like in her own words about writing this, and then it also has a thing from Percy Shelley about her writing it. And then the appendix in the back has a lot of good information. You may have noticed lots of number 4 or something, and you can kind of look in the back and see.
I love how it
So
had,
many literary
the
references.
The vampire story in the back.
Oh yeah, it's got the vampire story in the back from the doctor. Yeah, Polidori's vampire stories back there too. So anyway, make sure you finish this first and then explore everything else. Go for it. Okay. Thanks guys. See you next week.
Thank you. Also, there's the one quote where it's like, with the whole world before me or whatever, something like that. And then I looked in the back and it was like, I think from Paradise Lost, it was Adam and Eve. That's what they said.
So fun.